In what universe are they going to make tanks, jets, bombs in any meaningful way? That money will be wasted if it's spent at all. Ultimately, our hope is that as this money begins to be wasted and it becomes apparent that this is a hopeless project, the actual root cause of how Europe is now a global energy vassal will be pondered. It's very clear how it happened. I mean, we've been writing about it for years, but I don't know what it will take for Brussels to realize that you can't take bricks from the bottom to put them on top indefinitely. The Jenga tower collapses, and that's what we're going to see.
Ten years ago, the German army showed up to NATO exercises with broomsticks masquerading as machine guns. The German defense minister at the time is now the European Commission's president, and she's pitching an €800 billion defense spending plan for the EU. But my guest today claims her latest effort is only going to end up just as embarrassing. Welcome back to the show, Doomberg.
Nick, great to be back with you. Looking forward to a very robust discussion.
Yeah, we'll try and get in some laughs, which very rarely Americans have such a good sense of humor.
If you can't laugh at life, especially with these headlines, I don't know how you get through the day.
All right, that's a big promise to the readers then. For those of you who don't know Doomberg, you must have been living in a green energy echo chamber for the last 4 years. Doomberg is the most successful finance and energy publication on Substack. It's written by a team of anonymous energy consultants and insiders who are represented by the form of a green chicken. In fact, Doomberg is now so popular, nobody bothers to ask why the hell they chose a green chicken anymore. So let's get straight into this. What sparked this interview, and I'm sure you've guessed based on the headline here, is this recent analysis of European defense spending plans. Various European defense stocks have already gone absolutely berserk lately, even more so than they already had. I think at one point, Rheinmetall AG was outperforming Nvidia. But Doomberg, you claim that European defense spending plans just aren't credible, and you have a unique take on why. So give us a brief overview of your claims first, and then we'll dig into each aspect of them.
You bet. Dreams of rearming Europe have been floating around Brussels for many, many years. And they typically involve a sort of a plan to centralize the spending through Brussels. And, all crises ultimately lead to the enlargement of the EU, which is the fundamental mission of any bureaucracy, which is to get bigger. And so enter the current crisis whipped up by President Trump and his standard tactic of generating media frenzies. And the European capitals have sort of fallen for that trap and suddenly find themselves fearing whether the US will pull out of NATO and whether they'll have to go to loan on Ukraine and all the stuff that everyone is, I'm sure, intimately familiar with right now. And in response, they've decided that they'll just spend their way into military might. And unfortunately, that's just not how it works. Military might is a derivative of industrial might. And industrial might is a derivative of energy might. And Europe, in the past 25 years, has proactively committed continental energy suicide. And as a consequence, they are slowly at first and now rapidly deindustrializing. And printing a bunch of euros is not going to affect those numbers whatsoever. And we lay bare in this piece, which we called Project Porcupine, in reference to Ursula von der Leyen's really bizarre analogy that her intent was to turn Ukraine into a steel porcupine so that Russia could not, quote, digest it. This is not the stuff of serious military strategists, if we're being completely honest. But nonetheless, we lay bare just how little of its own energy Europe produces. And then we make mention of the fact that last we checked, bombs were pretty energy intense, tanks were pretty energy intense, and bullets and guns and trucks. If you could print your way into global military relevance, anybody could be a military power. It's just not how it works. So happy to take it in any direction that hits you after you read the piece and listen to my opening answer.
Yeah, well, your structure in the piece is obviously deliberate, right? You start by pointing out just how energy dependent Europe is. And this should come as an absolute shock to everyone who's been hearing the headlines about how wonderful renewable energy is instead, right? So take us through just
Sure.
how energy dependent Europe is.
Yeah, this is sort of a classic Doomberg analysis where we try to cut through the headlines. And these are all publicly available data sets that anybody can obtain, and we often will always link to them so that people can recreate our homework. At its core, the 27 member states of the European Union, which is the limit of our analysis, which is Ursula von der Leyen's domain. Notably, those states do not include Norway and the UK, the two reasonably large energy producers in Europe, but the EU is the EU, and the euros are what we are discussing here. Those 27 member states consume roughly 60 exajoules of primary energy per year. This is all data taken from the Statistical Review of World Energy, which publishes every June. And we have to make a few assumptions because many of those 27 member states are too small to show up in the various tables and are grouped into an other category, but we make very generous assumptions. Of those 60 exajoules, 2/3, or 40 exajoules, are derived from the burning of oil, natural gas, and coal. All right, now we know that as it existed at the end of 2023, those 27 countries required 40 exajoules of hydrocarbon energy to keep their economies going. Now we want to layer on a new military-industrial complex on top of that. Where are they getting those exajoules? Well, you then construct for oil, gas, and coal separately how much do each of those countries produce? And by our math, they produce only 6 exajoules of hydrocarbon energy, and the plurality of that is coal, primarily in Germany. And so when you don't make your own energy, this is actually a really important point that is lost on people. You are by definition paying for the entire cost of capital of everybody involved in the chain from well to delivery. Logistics, midstreamers, E&Ps, you name it, you are paying their fully loaded costs plus an equity rider to get that material to you.
Let's define those terms or give people a general idea of what you're talking about here. You're talking about the fact that the companies providing these resources, they want to make money doing so, and that effectively adds to the customer's cost.
Yeah, let's take a real example and work backwards. LNG, liquefied natural gas, landed at the Dutch TTF hub. All right, that gas is regasified at an LNG import terminal. Who built that terminal? Somebody did, and they expect a profit for taking liquefied natural gas off a cargo ship and converting it into pressurized pipeline gas that can then be used downstream. The pipelines that go from that import terminal to the power plant where it's burned also need to be compensated. The owners of the cargo ship who built that ship, very expensive ship to build, you have to pay their cost of capital for that. The diesel that they burned, or LNG, internally, as they went from, say, the Gulf Coast of the United States all the way across the Atlantic into that hub, all of that needs to be paid for. And by the way, the LNG export facility owned by, let's say, Venture Global along the U.S. Gulf Coast, they spend billions of dollars to build these facilities, and they have to operate them. They need to be paid. The pipeline operator who takes natural gas, say, from the Permian and connects it to Venture Global's LNG export terminal, they need to be paid. And then the oil and gas driller at the well. And by the way, even between that, there's gas separator plants and so on. Like, there's just a dizzying array of enterprises between a natural gas molecule that starts in Western Texas and gets burned in Frankfurt, Germany. And every single player in that chain needs to be paid. Perhaps for a while, a few of them might take a small loss, but this is not sustainable. And ultimately, molecules will be redirected because the LNG market is a global one. And so you compare the cost of natural gas for, say, a steelmaker in Germany, who's dependent on that fuel source to make their product, to a steelmaker even in the US, or let alone in China, which relies on cheap, dirty coal, an abundance of cheap, dirty coal to do the same thing, to an American producer who's backed into pipeline natural gas in the US, which is selling at a third of the cost. You just can't compete. And so what happens over time is you shut down your steel mills. And then your automakers become very impaired, as we're seeing in Germany today. Now, if you want to take that situation, which, by the way, there's no sign that there's any reversal of policy being considered. Solar, wind, not even nuclear. We got to accelerate the green energy transition. In what universe are they going to make tanks, jets, bombs in any meaningful way? That money will be wasted if it's spent at all. And, ultimately, our hope is that as this money begins to be wasted and it becomes apparent that this is a hopeless project, the actual root cause of how Europe is now a global energy vassal will be pondered. It's very clear how it happened. I mean, we've been writing about it for years, but I don't know what it will take for Brussels to realize that you can't take bricks from the bottom to put them on top indefinitely. The Jenga tower collapses, and that's what we're going to see.
So we'll quickly get to why the European energy dependency makes it a vassal and just how dependent it is. But on this LNG point, the current European strategy is like, don't worry, we'll just transition to LNG and just import the gas we need. This Russian gas issue is not going to be a problem. And you're claiming there that even if they get all these LNG terminals up and running and everything works out swimmingly, it's still not going to be cheap enough to make them.
What they're doing with that argument is they are conflating availability with price. Sure, if you build up enough storage facilities and import facilities and the infrastructure you need, yes, you will not run out of molecules. You'll just be paying the highest price for those molecules compared to every other power. You cannot be sustainably a military power without really producing your own energy. Look at World War II. Like, every war in history can be explained through the lens of energy. The country that produced the most energy and used it the wisest wins. I mean, a bomb is concentrated energy delivered upon your enemy. Right? That the energy that goes in to make those bombs is real. That's like physics. That bill has to be paid. The U.S. was the power behind World War II because we were the world's largest oil producer, and well, of course, I live in the U.S. We had oceans separating us from most of the war. But nonetheless, the Germans really got squeezed on the energy side of things in World War II, and that led to the collapse of what was a very, industrially powerful country. You can fake it for a while. You can run it on coal. You can make coal to jet fuel. You could do all the things the Germans did, but ultimately, in the long run, the commodity base of the Allies proved triumphant. The same with Japan. Japan went to war to get oil, and they attacked Pearl Harbor because of the oil embargo that Roosevelt imposed on them. I mean, how it is that in 2025 we've lost this basic understanding of how wars work is beyond me. Like, when I hear them talk and they pose for their pictures and they speak in platitudes, like we said in the piece, if platitudes were all you needed to make bombs, I mean, they would be a superpower.
Well, listen, you're reminding me of an awkward memory here. I think it was Christmas Eve 2018. My German mother asked my Japanese parents-in-law why they attacked Pearl Harbor. So I think you've provided the answer that we all needed to hear. That didn't go down so well at the time, I can assure you. But my father-in-law did give much the same explanation. And of course, this explains a lot about French and Japanese energy policy since. But let's return to just how dependent Europe is, because the numbers are quite important here. So you've got those charts that show how much the Europeans produce in terms of these different fossil fuels. You've also pointed out in the piece that the dependency, so the import, is about the same as the entire natural gas production of the US. And it's far more than the primary energy consumption of South and Central America. And you've got some other crazy figures there. So how does this turn them into a vassal, and how ridiculous does it make their idea of increasing the defense spending by 800 billion euros?
Well, first of all, when you're completely dependent upon the rest of the world, complex supply chains, for basically the majority of your primary energy, that means you are forever one terrorist attack away from a meaningful energy crisis. I'll just give you one example that we referenced in the piece to some controversy. The Russians claim that the Ukrainians launched a drone attack at the Turk Stream pipeline at a compressor station in Russian territory that pushes gas out into the Turk Stream pipeline, which, by the way, is one of the two remaining pipeline links between Russia and Europe. Both go under the sea into Turkey and then go on into countries like Hungary and Slovakia, who you might notice aren't too keen on the war continuing for this very reason, because the gas that used to transit through Ukraine was turned off, and now they're wholly dependent on this one pipeline. So imagine if that attack had been successful, what would that have done to Europe? So what happens is very small shortages cause dramatic spikes in price for the entirety of the bill. Sure, you have some long-term contracts and so on, but spot prices explode, and that tends to create significant economic damage to the buyer and a windfall to the sellers. And so there was a suspicious explosion of the Freeport LNG export facility at the height of the last energy crisis, which many were wondering whether that event wasn't in some way connected to the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline. Maybe your suppliers will slow roll their delivery to you in the hopes of causing prices to go up. When you're on the bad side of inelasticity, you are a vassal. You are subject to the whims of the weather, of fringe terrorist groups, of greedy capitalists. When you control your own resources, the Chinese, who are short oil, but they have an abundance of coal and they still import more because they want to have giant piles of coal that they know they could always tap into at very reasonable price that feeds their industrial base. We did a full Doom Zoom presentation for our Pro Tier last year. It was very popular, called The Year of the Dragon, China Through the Lens of Energy. And you could just see the strategic thinking behind almost everything China does, especially in the energy space. And that strategic thinking is completely lacking in Brussels. One wonders how it could be, of course. And you mentioned van der Leyen's disastrous tour as the head of defense in Germany, and classic bureaucratic Peter principle, got promoted beyond her competency. And, to hear such proclamations that have no connection to physics whatsoever, it doesn't inspire confidence in the rest of their decision-making abilities, does it? And so the main issues are expense, first and foremost. You are paying the highest price. And the commodities that those energies feed are cutthroat price takers. And so when you're at the high end of the cost curve, your industry shuts down. And then you're also subject to the whims of all of these fringe actors. And so just to close with one small example, in the US today, a whole series of multi-billion-dollar ethane-only crackers are being built, and they're displacing old naphtha crackers in Europe. Cheap natural gas liquids in the US, expensive oil-based chemical facilities in Europe, and you're seeing new ones get built here and old expensive ones get shut down there. This is just what happens. Like it's the funny part about all of this, Nick, is it's just so utterly predictable.
One of the issues you raised there I want to touch on before we move on is these pipelines that have a habit of sort of exploding predictably or unpredictably, depending on who you are. What that's doing is increasing the vulnerability of the system to one more explosion, right? So if you had 5 pipelines, but 3 blew up, then there's only 2 left, and it only takes one more to get you into deep trouble. And so to what extent is Europe sort of teetering on the edge where it only takes, one more domino before the whole thing goes?
Well, it's interesting. We're working on a piece where we talk about this special forces operation through an empty now gas pipeline in Suja in Ukraine, which, depending on whose propaganda you believe, was either, the stuff of military war films or a complete disaster. But that doesn't really matter to us. What matters to us is this is yet another escalation. Before the Nord Stream pipelines were blown up, whoever did it, big, whodunit mystery, this was kind of considered off limits. And when Nord Stream happened, it wasn't just the gas that's gone practically forever. It's the precedent that it sets, which is what we wrote about immediately in a piece called Decades and Minutes, I believe. If the wanton destruction of multi-billion-dollar, deca-billion-dollar energy complexes is fair game, even in sort of a proxy battle, then you're in trouble. And look, Russia has been proactively targeting what is mostly civilian energy infrastructure and what we have been repeatedly calling a war crime. We think it is a war crime. This is what happens when you when you normalize the destruction of the core elements of modern society. And so Nord Stream gets blown up. We have an issue in Freeport. There's been multiple attacks on Turkstream. There's now calls because of the Russian special forces use of a 1.4 meter high pipeline. Apparently they walked 15 kilometers through this pipeline in at least nobody would argue that it wasn't a daring mission. Whether it succeeded or not, I suppose, is in the eye of the beholder. But there's now calls for the sealing or the destroying of all gas pipeline links between Russia and Europe because these are now literal weapons. I mean, put it this way, the thrust of the piece we're writing coming up is if you see a Turkstream explosion, or if Russia just decides they've had enough with Europe and they turn off the gas, arbitrarily, which they can always do, you're going to see a very difficult winter coming up for Europe, depending on the weather, because gas levels right now in Europe are dangerously low, which is another reason why this whole talk of rearmament and reindustrialization is happy talk. It's nonsense. We are seeing gas levels that are roughly the equivalent of where they were back in 2022. How could it be 3 years later? One slightly cold winter, and Europe is right back into potentially facing a crisis. Now, look, the markets aren't pricing that in yet, which we're going to get into, but it's still there. If we have a cold snap in the next 3 weeks, we're going to enter refilling season with nearly empty tanks. Britain is out of natural gas, by the way. I mean, it's amazing.
But Doomberg, none of this matters because Europe now has this interconnected grid of renewables and all these, cables across the Baltic Sea, which means it's energy independent and not vulnerable at all.
Yes, of course. That is, of course, why it is that their booming industry is overpowering the rest of the world, because their energy is free. It comes from the sun and it comes from the wind. It doesn't cost anything. It's free. The big fallacy of renewable energy. In fact, what we're seeing is political movements in places like Norway to cut those cables, because all those cables have done is transmit the intermittency and the risks associated with it to those countries and cause their power bills to go up, even though they have an abundance of hydropower. Same deal with France, who has an abundance of nuclear power. They're just basically tying themselves to drowning swimmers. And guess what? People don't like it when their power bills triple, especially industry. Look, the grand fallacy, the big lie behind renewables is that they are, quote, cheap. And that's basically because the sleight of hand being used universally in all such proclamations is a temporary variable price, which ignores the new average price that accounts for both making room for those on existing grids and what happens when they decide not to show up, which happens actually quite often every night for solar and for weeks at a time for wind. And because of that, in order to keep the grid going, you need an amazing and expensive array of backup technologies. And the full cost of forcing intermittency onto a grid is never accounted for when people are saying solar and wind are cheap. And so they can lie to themselves all they want, which they are. I mean, they're just outright lies. But lies don't pay the bills, right? And so this is how Europe got into this position. They believe their own lies.
But what makes this really come to the fore right now is this subsea cable drama, with all these cables being cut by Chinese vessels, supposedly by accident. Because even if the renewables grid, did work, and having an internet-connected grid allows you to move power from wherever the sun is shining and the wind is blowing to where it's not, the vulnerability would still be there to the same extent. The fact that someone can get away with Nord Stream sabotage suggests that they can probably get away with the same thing with subsea power links, if the Norwegians weren't willing to cut them off.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to make sense of what's going on with those stories. We read them with interest. It would seem a bizarre thing for the Chinese to be doing that, given their trading relationship with Europe and their long-stated desire to remain neutral, even if they have a strong relationship with Russia. So who knows what's going on? But, you could always cut natural gas pipelines. I don't think such risks are unique to renewable energy, but nor do I think having more renewable energy insulate you from such risks. And so back to our whole discussion about the dangerous precedent of normalizing the wanton destruction of critical energy infrastructure. I mean, whoever did Nord Stream crossed a very dangerous red line. And by the way, the winners of energy wars are the ones that produce the most. So even if some of your infrastructure is attacked, you'd have to attack an awful lot of the US energy infrastructure for the US to feel it. Look at all the attacks on the Russian refining industry that we see, these films of drone attacks launched by the Ukrainians that seem to cause explosions, and then you don't really see it in the data. It doesn't show up. Why? Because the Russian energy complex is sprawling, right? And yes, you may cause a building or a storage tank at a refinery to explode, but they have such robustness and such durability that arises from that robustness that to take them out completely is nearly impossible. Whereas with the Europeans, who are always riding on the brink, a little bit goes a long way, and that's the difference. And so if you made your own energy, if you had a mountain of coal, you'd be fine. But they don't, and so they're not fine. And so to think that they can do this is well, I mean, it'll take years for our predictions to be proven right, but we have no doubt that they will be.
But Doomberg, there's an opportunity to kill sort of two chickens with one stone here, which is that spending all this money on defense industries allows Europe to reindustrialize. Is that going to work?
Well, not if they don't spend a big chunk of that money rearming themselves from an energy perspective, because all you're doing is temporarily subsidizing industries that will require that subsidy in perpetuity to stay competitive, because they won't have economically viable access to the energy they will continue to need to run their plants. It's the same with their dreams about AI. Where are AI data centers being scaled? In places like Malaysia, where they have a ton of natural gas, in the Permian, in Alberta. Those markets are going to where molecules are cheap and nearby. Why send molecules around the world when you can send data? And so if Europe builds a bunch of military factories without pondering what's going to power those factories, you can guess how that's going to end, with a bunch of empty factories. Because every bomb you make will lose money. And so it'll be wasted. By the way, that's assuming that factories can be efficiently commanded into formation by Brussels, which has precisely no history of doing anything efficiently except growing.
It's also assuming that the Americans and Russians and whoever else will sell the Europeans the energy they need to produce these goods.
Yeah, so Russia is becoming less and less of a factor. The US is becoming more and more of a factor. And if they scream Orange Man bad too loudly, he might decide to reimpose an LNG export ban. Or, frankly, more realistically, if demand from AI drives US domestic natural gas prices too high, you could bet that exports will be slowed to keep prices low domestically. That's what producers of excess energy get to decide to do. They can keep more for themselves. Russia has two prices for diesel, a domestic one and an international one. And as a producer of excess energy, far beyond what it needs, it has a lot of cards to play, to use an analogy that seems to be popular these days. Europe has no cards, but they are bluffing. And everybody at the table can see their cards. And they can see that they're bluffing. Well, we did say we would have a few laughs today. So.
It sounds like there's going to be a hell of a lot of arms factories in Norway in coming years.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's outside of the EU, to be clear. But of all the countries in Europe, Norway has by far the sanest energy policy, and they're the richest. It's just not a confusion. Hey, oil prices are high. We have a recession. Oil prices are cheap. The economy is booming. Oh, Saudi Arabia has a lot of oil. Man, they seem to be very rich. This is not five-dimensional chess. It's very simple thinking. Norway has executed an infinitely better energy strategy than the UK, both of whom are sort of splitting the North Sea. Which of those countries is wealthier? Which has a stronger industry? Which has a sovereign wealth fund that has secured the financial future of generations of Norwegians? By the way, which country didn't even experiment with the euro, unlike the British did before deciding to get out? The Norwegians. They kept their head on straight. And guess what? They have 90% of their electricity comes from hydro. It's the cheapest baseload electricity in the world. They have an abundance of advantages, and so they win. It's just the way it works.
Yeah, and crucially, they're not energy vassals of somewhere else, which allows them to control their own geopolitics. No one can really corral them in.
And by the way, a country of 5 million people. I mean, this is they're the size what of Ireland. I mean, yes, correct. Energy vassals lose, and energy powers win.
So Europe would have to go back to producing vast amounts of its own cheap energy if any of this defense plan stuff was going to play out, or any of this reindustrialization story or economic growth story that we keep hearing about. What is the likelihood of that, and what is the capacity for that to happen?
Less than zero, and the capacity is unknown because nobody's allowed to go look. Right? Europe is a garden. We don't drill for oil in our garden. We don't frack for natural gas in our garden. We don't even keep our nuclear power plants on in our garden. So I think the first test would be whether Germany begins to relight their nuclear power plants, get them going again. We doubt it. We'll see. But if it can't even do that, what hope do they have where are they going to get their molecules? They've made it so forbidden to even talk about it that they've locked themselves into this corner where they think they can just print euros and bombs show up on the other end of the printer. And it's just not how it works. Now, they can print euros and buy weapons, which is what we think they're ultimately going to have to do. But again, there's all kinds of vulnerabilities that come with that. And in fact, we think this is Trump's overarching objective, which is he can cut Pentagon spending without hurting the military-industrial complex if there's another bidder in the market, and Europe is, falling for his tricks and deciding to be another bidder.
That's one of the things that's baffled me throughout this. Is Trump very clearly stated he wants Europe to increase its defense spending, and yet, if you read the media in Europe, it's portraying this rearmament of Europe plan as an act of defiance against Trump, and it just. So I just don't know what to make of that.
Well, as we mentioned in this piece we're working on, NATO weapons come with specifications, which are meant to drive harmony and interoperability. And in reality, it just creates mandated monopolies for U.S. weapons producers. And so the reason Trump has been demanding that Europe, quote unquote, spends more, it's not because he has an empathetic desire to see Europe strong and secure. It's because he's creating demand for the military-industrial complex that is a very powerful political force in the United States. Because I think we noticed in the Financial Times just this morning that Ursula von der Leyen was out saying this first tranche of 150 billion should be spent on European-based weapons makers and so on. Well, there's only so many of them, and they're probably reliant on U.S. and Chinese subcomponent manufacturers, and so that money will find its way eventually to U.S. coffers, which probably is Trump's objective from the beginning.
And investors take note that those US defense stocks have not participated in the rally alongside European ones, which makes this an interesting analysis. What do you think this whole defense spending boom is really all about then, given how absurd it patently is? You mentioned earlier that every crisis is an opportunity for Europe to integrate and harmonize. Our audience in the UK would intuitively understand that argument, but let's make it explicit.
Sure. Look what happened in Germany. So Merz runs an entire campaign swearing that he will never break the debt brake, the constitutionality of it. The first sign of a crisis, which seemed, again, his response seemed rather sophisticated and planned long in advance. Boom, out goes the Constitution, in comes the printing press. Every German who has grandparents or great-grandparents that suffered through Weimar, should the hair on their, on their neck should stand up. Van der Leyen is out with a centralization proposal. France is jockeying to control more of the money. It's all the same old games that we see in the European, geopolitical, centuries-old campaigns amongst these countries. But ultimately, the big test is whether we'll see the issuance of Eurobonds, because that will set a precedent that'll never stop. And ultimately, if we see the issuance of Eurobonds, it's the beginning of the end of the nation states of Europe. assuming the European Union can survive this, which we don't think it probably can if they go full steam ahead. Just look what's going on in Romania, for example. And so ultimately, the intent of Brussels, which is transparent, is to take over defense spending from the nation states, the member nation states of the European Union, to transform the European Union from an economic union to a geopolitical one, which it was never meant to be. You had the European Union and you had NATO, and they served separate missions. And now we're seeing convergence of those things. And you might even see the US pull out of NATO and a European treaty organization replace it. Where do you think that's going to be headquartered out of? It's not going to be Paris. It's not going to be London. It's going to be Brussels. And that's the goal. That's the game. And it's very transparent. And this is what bureaucracies do. And there is no greater bureaucracy in the world than the European Union.
But I would argue that your analysis suggests that that's not viable in the sense that they just wouldn't have the military capacity to put up much of an alliance.
Well, you can print the money and you could waste the money. Those two things are very viable and are what we'll likely see. Whether that translates into an army is a whole different question, but that's not the real objective anyway. The real objective is to enrich your cronies and to concentrate power in Brussels, and that's what we'll see. There will be many people who get very rich by the breaking of the constitutional debt breaks, the lifting of those, especially in Germany. Look, there's plenty of printing power to be had. They'll do it. And what happens in countries where that happens, which we've seen in the US, is we see vast disparities in income inequality. A small number of people get very, very rich. And the rest of society is left to struggle. I mean, the social welfare payments of Europe are going to be diverted to these endeavors. They're not just going to print. To do what they're talking about on the scale that they're dreaming of is going to require a whole recalibration of the relationship between civilian and state, or in this case, civilian and megastate. And the European Union is going to once and for all try to snuff out nationalism, especially in the sort of edge states. And we'll see if they succeed. But that's what's going on. That's the real objective. If the milestones are, does Germany restart nuclear? And does Brussels issue war bonds, euro bonds, whatever you call them, debt backed by the collective as opposed to the nation state? And that is a significant milestone that we expect to see. Doesn't mean it won't be wasted. Doesn't mean it will result in a military. But the end of it will be more power for Brussels and less for the countries that compose it.
And the ability to vilify anyone who stands up against it as pro-Russian is a key part of that.
Of course, yes. The Digital, Services Act, or whatever it's called. The technology is in place to censor. This is why J.D. Vance's speech was such a watershed and was received so badly. I think he was both correct and brave to say it, where he did and when he did. What's going on in Romania it takes the mask off of what's really going on. The semantic shift of the word democracy is profound. It doesn't mean what you and I grew up thinking it meant, at least not in Europe anymore. And neither does the phrase free speech mean what we thought it meant. We'll see what happens in the UK. There's a real struggle within the UK. Keep a keen eye on, Reform UK's poll numbers and so on. The election in Germany was awfully convenient in its results. So we'll see. I mean, look, these leaders are wildly unpopular. Starmer's not popular. Lord knows Macron is not popular. I mean, who's super excited about Merz or Olaf Scholz? I mean, these people aren't particularly popular politicians. They're polling in the 30s and the 20s and the teens. And so, we'll see whether nationalism and populism can truly be contained. It won't be able to be contained without the sort of crackdown measures that you referred to in your question, which we're seeing. And anybody who denies that or thinks that this is all in response to, a counter response to Russian disinformation campaigns is just believing a load of you-know-what.
So I'm going to try and sum up your argument here. It seems like this European defense spending plan is all about Europeans claiming that they can use Russian gas that they can't access to power armaments factories that don't exist in order to produce weapons they can't afford in order to fight Russia over Ukraine, through which Russian gas gets to them. Have I got it right?
It's pretty close. And it is as silly as you make it sound. And so that the weird part is it's not that far off from reality. And so, yeah, that's pretty much it. And all really in the secret name of concentrating more and more power in Brussels.
And I'll just pop up a big quote here from you from the end of your piece, I think. There will be no EU military surge of consequence. If the US truly does pull the plug, the war's end will swiftly follow. That sounds pretty good to me. Is that what the Americans are trying to achieve here, apart from this spending on the military-industrial complex? They're basically trying to end the war. What's their incentive for that?
I think Trump generally wants the war to end. For all of his behavior, and the way in which that behavior is portrayed in sort of traditional media outlets, he has consistently said that the war should never have started, that it wouldn't have started if he were president, that he would like the war to end, and that ultimately, in order for the war to end, you have to really understand and reflect upon the reality on the ground and deal with the consequences as they are. Look, wars are terrible. Wars are terrible for both sides. They're especially terrible for the side that loses. Borders get changed by force all the time. How the losing side accepts defeat often determines the depth of the crisis that that country will subsequently suffer. It's forever thus. Nobody likes to lose a war. Nobody should like to be in a war. Some wars are just, other wars more questionable. Whatever your views are here, we've studied this war very carefully, Nick. Every day we pull up both Ukrainian and Russian mapping services to see where the lines of contact have been moving. And having done that every day for a year, you get a pretty clear sense of where the trajectory of the war is going. And then you compare that sort of, direct information that anybody could go and get with the way in which the war has been portrayed in the media, stalemate, or a few more months and the Russian economy will collapse, or all of this other stuff that is repeated so often and so loudly that understandably so many people who don't spend the time to go and look at the primary source data, the open source intelligence data, they believe it. And so then when reality is forced upon them by a character like Trump, hey, this war is basically lost. Russia is outproducing NATO 3-1 in weapons. Ukraine is a small country. They have fought with courage. But the trajectory of this war, it's very clear.
But what I don't understand about that, Doomberg, is, and maybe I'm too cynical here, but the Americans benefit from the war, and the Europeans, what's the opposite of benefit? Miss out, they lose out, they're harmed by the continuation of the war. And yet, if you look at who's pushing for peace and who's pushing for more war, it's reversed.
Sure. The U.S. is harmed in a way as well. First of all, its weapons have been proven to be less effective. And the Russian
That just means you need to buy more.
Sure, but it's embarrassing for the U.S. to have lost this war. I think it is. Look, NATO lost a kinetic conflict with Russia. That's not good for NATO. It's not good for the U.S. And if that loss is total, i.e., borders are imposed by military only and no diplomacy by military means, that's a bigger loss for NATO and the U.S. And at some point, you have to know when to cut your losses. And I do believe that Trump looks at the killing and he says things like, I see, boys the age of my son dying in a needless war. And they're beautiful people. He says that. I mean, every person that died in this war on both sides was somebody's kid, somebody's brother, somebody's cousin, somebody's friend, somebody's neighbor. I think it's very easy for those of us who have the comfort of distance to stand on principle and say we should fight. It's just not that easy. And I genuinely think Trump wants peace. And he would like Europe to rearm, knowing that they're probably not going to be able to do so in a time that affects the Ukraine situation, but they will replace the bid under the feet of the military-industrial complex of the U.S. That the cessation of violence in Ukraine would create that vacuum. And so, sure, there's a cynical interpretation as well, but he's the only leader, aside from Viktor Orban, who's been openly calling for peace in Ukraine for many months. And that he won the election fair and square means he gets to impose U.S. foreign policy in his making. And that's what he said about doing. I think he's been very, very consistent with his campaign promises. So that this is a surprise to anybody is only because they haven't done their homework. The man has had 4 years to plan his return to the White House and has hit the ground running, to say the least.
I think it's another example of, as you hinted at earlier, Trump positioning his opponents where he wants to put them by taking the opposite position, right? So he's positioned them as the pro-war party, and they're stuck with that now, which is not going to be a nice place to be. I remember a few years ago, I went on GB News, so I think it was my first time ever on live TV, and I made the argument that you make in your piece that sanctions on Russian energy exports harm the customers, so us, the UK, more so than the Russians. When I made that claim, it didn't go down so well with the host, I can tell you. What is your explanation to back me up here?
Sure, we wrote a piece called Crazy Pills in April of 2022, making this exact point. Like long before it was popular or easy to say so, it comes back to inelasticity. So let's do a thought experiment. Let's imagine that the US and British navies, to the extent that the British still have one, successfully impose a complete embargo on all Russian energy. The totality of Russia's oil comes off the market. What's the price of oil? Right? It's $1,000 a barrel. It's utterly destructive. The US Navy should be accompanying every Russian oil tanker to market to make it as seamless as possible for every molecule of fossil fuels to get to the market. Why? You win sanctions wars against energy producers on price, not volume. If we had flooded the market, like James Baker went to the Middle East and had done before the first Gulf War, you can have a war between Iraq and Kuwait where energy prices are amazingly stable because the world is awash in cheap hydrocarbons. The break-even price for Putin in 2022 was widely known, roughly $40 a barrel. Get the price of oil below $40 a barrel, and the profits from energy cannot fund the war machine. They still have plenty of energy to make bombs and do other things, but they won't have the profits. They are predominantly an export, at least on the oil side. And so if Biden had called in the oil and gas producers and said, we are going to temporarily crush the price of oil, which is going to hurt your profits, and in return, we're going to give you a whole series of long-term leases to federal lands, and we're going to term out the refilling of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve at prices that are lucrative for you, that allow you to take the risk of drilling today. Let's go. And we're going to do this for a year. The war would have ended in 2022. Instead, we made it super expensive for oil to get to the market. And if we took 5% of Russia's exports off the market, do you think the price of oil was more than 5% higher? Of course it was. They made it up on price and then some. We enriched the Russian war machine through sanctions. We made the Russian economy more robust, not more fragile, through sanctions. Sanctions against major energy producers, at least sanctions that attack volume, never work. They're designed to backfire, and they did in this case. And I think we've written 3 or 4 follow-up pieces reiterating that point. One of them was called whack-a-mole. You tax one, or you sanction one ghost ship, and another pops up, right? I mean, the shipping industry is notorious for circumventing the law, and the value is not in the insurance policy, it's in the oil. And so this is just, it's designed by people who have spent no time in industry, and they failed. And you were correct to say it. We were correct to write it. And if a host is uncomfortable by that, well, that's on them, because the truth is the truth, and we should be guided by truth.
It's the domestic harm that fascinated me at the time, making energy prices more expensive during an energy crisis. Shooting yourself in the foot, cutting off your nose to spite your face, all those sorts of analogies work. Well, Doomberg, I hope we've helped the readers and viewers see how energy is the lens through which they should see all of these geopolitical issues. And that is, in turn, of course, why they should be subscribing to Doomberg. So if they don't already, actually, I should say. So if you want to be able to predict what happens next in this chessboard of geopolitics, do subscribe. What's the easiest way for them to find you?
Doomberg.com is now the home of all things Doomberg, our newsletter, our pro-tier webinars, our podcast appearances like this one. The full archive of all of our letters and our pro-tier webinars are also available for each of those categories of subscribers. Free subscribers get previews to all of our pieces as well, and occasionally a free one, so they can get a sense of what their hard-earned money will get them if they do jump over and become a paid subscriber. Nick, it was really great. Always excited to talk to you and looking forward to the next one as well.
Yeah, I should repeat that. You do release parts of your pieces for free. So at the very least, everyone go and check out the free version of the articles. I have no doubt that you'll end up subscribing. Americans refer to politically motivated government waste as pork barrel spending. I have no idea why, by the way. But the lesson investors can take from this video with Doomberg is that Project Porcupine should really be called Project Porcupine. It's all about trying to funnel Europe's defense spending towards either European or US companies. That's the real battle taking place here between the EU and US over Ukraine. Doomberg's insight is that European companies don't have the economic conditions needed to actually profit from such pork barrel spending because their energy bill would be too expensive. And so American defense stocks might be a better buy. Interestingly, the market does not agree with this prediction. US defense stocks have performed poorly, while European ones have gone absolutely berserk since the EU's €800 billion defense spending plan was announced. If Doomberg is right and European defense spending ends up flowing to the US instead of EU, this might be a buying opportunity in those American companies. Investors should consider US defense stocks or the iShares US Aerospace and Defense ETF, which has the ticker code ITA, in the US at least. And for full disclosure, this is a stock that I cover in a newsletter that I'm the investment director of. If you're skeptical about this idea, remember how Europe's green energy transition dream ended up playing out. Instead of European companies dominating the industry and European jobs being created, the EU is now reliant on China for its green dream hardware. The same could have happened again with Europe's latest obsession, defense spending. The other possibility is, of course, that Europe does have a major U-turn on its energy policy and turns back to fossil fuels in a big, big way. That's a prediction you'll be hearing more about on this channel next week. So if you enjoyed this video, please do subscribe to our YouTube channel to ensure you don't miss that video or any of our other upcoming content. Thanks for watching.